Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Alexey, and today I have a special guest, Phil Pluskota. Mr. Pluskota is a mixing and master engineer, but he is known for his heavy guitar tones and massive range of amps, cabinets, and guitar pedals. Also, Mr. Pluskota is a founder of Sonic Assault Studios. In our today's interview with Mr. Pluskota, we're gonna be talking about creating professional metal guitar tones. It's a huge honor to have you on my YouTube channel today, Mr. Pluskota. And let's start our interview. Which guitar amps would you recommend for metal?
So for metal recordings and just recordings in general, PV5150 is always number one. That'll work for just about anything. Mesa Boogie Dual Rectifier and some sort of Marshall, whether it be a JCM or like a JVM. Those work perfect for metal, especially for like smaller studios that don't have budgets to get higher end amps or ones that are like $3,000 to $4,000. But if you have the money for a really expensive amp, a Bogner Ecstasy can pretty much do everything. And that'd be another one that I'd recommend.
Should you choose a specific guitar amp for a specific metal subgenre? For instance, should you choose a specific guitar amp for black metal, power metal, deathcore? So how does it work?
So usually with all those subgenres, you can actually use similar amps for all of them. It just depends on how you're miking them up, what speaker cabinet you're using, and then also what you're hitting them with the front end. But pretty much like black metal, power metal, and deathcore, you could use a 5150 for all three of those and be successful with getting tones for all of those. But if you have like a certain sound in mind for a record, you definitely want to gravitate towards an amplifier that'll fit those needs a little bit better than just like kind of like a amp like a 5150 that can kind of just do it all.
What is your opinion on guitar amp plugins?
Oh, they're fantastic. So a lot of like the newer guitar amp plugins sound really good. You can make great records with plugins without using real amps. I still prefer real amps for their movement and the space that they give, but you can pretty much use any Neural DSP plugin or any STL Tones plugin and get good results with those. The only thing I think you need to do with plugins is you have to go through the impulse responses to find which ones actually sound the best for what you're looking to do with that particular amp synth.
What are the main differences between a real guitar amp and an amp plugin for you?
So for me with real amplifiers, because you're pushing real air, it's not a static sound. You're getting a lot more dynamics. Even though if it's high gain guitars, it's going to be very compressed naturally, you're still going to get more movement in the mid-range, more movement in the low end. So it just sounds more wide and more 3D is the way I would put it. So with amp sims, they always kind of just sound flat to me in a mix whenever you dial them in. Even if you process them a lot to try to get more movement out of them, or use something like Bogren Digital's IRDX just to kind of get more movement out of the impulse response, real amps always just have more weight to them and just more space. They just kind of just work a little bit easier in a mix for me than using plugins.
Can you create a professional metal guitar tone using amp plugins?
Absolutely. Like nowadays, with everything that you can do in the box, like you can literally make a professional sounding record with all plugins, with all amp sims, without having anything analog at all. It just depends on your ear, if you have good balance in your mix, and then also if the tracks are good. So if you get good DI tracks, that'll make it so much easier to get a good guitar tone with any amp sim, whether or not you're using like a cheap amp sim or you're using something a little bit more expensive. You can pretty much dial in a professional sound with just about anything. Like it's pretty much the easiest it's ever been to get good results with very little gear. But having better gear definitely will get you there a little bit quicker. But I really do like where amp sims have been going as far as the quality of them. But on a lot of records, yeah, the guys will get DI sent to them when they're mixing a record, just because a lot of bands either don't have the budget to go to a good studio or go to a good space and set up real amplifiers and play through them for the records. So they just do DIs and then just kind of give the mixing engineer an idea of where they want that to go, so you can reamp that later to get the exact sound you want. But if you don't have all of that, amp sims are totally fine for working on professional records.
How should you prepare for recording guitars with either a real amp or an amp plugin?
So if you're getting ready to go into the studio to record regardless, like you definitely want to get your guitar set up and intonate it and always have fresh strings with you. Because whenever I'm tracking a band we're usually changing guitar strings at least once every song, if not once every half of the song, depending on if we're quad tracking or dual tracking. But you always want to check, make sure that your intonation is good, just so notes are ringing out true. And also you want to just make sure they're set up just so you're getting the best performance out of that instrument. But as far as that preparation goes, you just want to make sure that you're well rehearsed on the songs whenever you're going to record. And then if you do have an idea of what you're looking to do sound wise or tone wise, just take a day or take half a day just to sit down with each other and just kind of go through guitar tones and figure out what fits the player's hands the best and what fits the vision that the band has for what they're working on.
What tips can you give for recording high-quality guitar DI tracks?
So for DI tracks, I personally prefer always using a dedicated DI over plugging into an audio interface. Some of the newer audio interfaces out there, like the Audient stuff, even like the Apollos have decent DIs on them. RME has amazing DIs built in. But I've always found I get better fidelity with a direct DI, like a dedicated DI box going directly into a preamp and that going right to my converter. There are ones out there where you don't even need a preamp that are much cleaner. So like a Undertone Audio GB tracker, like that you can just plug directly into. That does line level directly to your converters. So that'll give you the most fidelity and also the cleanest sound going directly to your converter with no coloration. But typically always a DI box sounds a little bit brighter, a little bit more depth. So when you do reamp later, if you need to, the DI quality is going to be much closer to what it would be coming directly out of the guitar, just so you have more of like the actual feel and the original sound of that guitar going through an amplifier.
What are the differences between recording a clean guitar signal through an audio interface versus using dedicated DI box?
Yeah, so that's like I was saying on the last question with the audio interfaces, depending on what audio interface you have, like say like a Focusrite interface, for example, their DIs always sound muddy. So there's always like this mid bump inside of those interfaces. It's just like a natural EQ curve of those where you don't get a lot of brightness. So it's like almost like the capacitance of the DI signal is really low. And it just sounds dark. It doesn't have any brightness to it. Sometimes, depending on the guitar, it's okay. But with a dedicated DI, I've always found that the fidelity of the signal is a lot better, more clean. So it's a little bit easier to work with as far as editing it because you can see the transient information a lot better. But also, whenever you're reamping or using real amps with those DIs, it's going to feel and sound a lot better. It's not going to sound dark and kind of lifeless. It's going to have more movement to it.
What is reamping and when should you use it?
So reamping is taking the clean DI that you recorded into your DAW and taking that out of your DAW through your converter to a box that's going to convert that from line level back down to instrument level to where you can go plug into any amplifier and pretty much just get the sound that you want based off of that performance that's in your DAW. The only time you really want to use reamping is if either you didn't have the budget to record real amps at the time of recording, or say like you have a sound that you committed to that you're not really happy with. You can later use that performance to get a different sound that'll fit the mix better. So reamping is always one of those things where like either you didn't get the tones right away and you kind of want to have somebody else who has the gear to do that for you, or you did record your sound on the way in while you're making your record and you're unhappy with it and you just want to have that DI to be able to later run through another amplifier to get a different sound for your mix.
What tips can you give for microphone placement when recording guitar cabinets?
So for that, what I personally do is a lot of people like to use white noise or pink noise when they're moving microphones around to find the sweet spot. I don't like to do that. That's not my favorite way of getting tones. I usually will play the amplifiers at like a lower volume than I would actually record. And I will sit there with a pair of headphones on with the guitars panned to the left. Because whenever you're dialing guitar tones, you never want to dial them in mono, because how they sound in mono is not how they sound when they're spread left and right. So typically I'll spread the guitars left and right, mostly left because that's my dominant ear. And I'll just sweep the microphone around until I find the spot that sounds the best in my headphones. And then after I get that mic placement, if I need to do another microphone, that's when I'll start moving around the other mic and make sure they're in phase with each other and then find the best blend between the two of them. But usually the best thing to do is just sit there and put a microphone on a cabinet while you're listening to the tones in context of the song, just so you can find the right spot for it to fit in the song. Because you can get an amazing guitar tone that sounds incredible by itself, but just might not work for the mix that you're trying to dial it in for.
How important is room ambience when creating a great guitar tone?
For metal, it's very, very little. Like, I try to have as little room ambience as possible in my guitar tones when I'm dialing in metal tones. If I'm doing like clean sounds or like mid-gain sounds that need a little bit more space to them, then I'll introduce a room microphone to kind of add a little bit more weight to a sound and just a little bit more of that room to it. But for high gain direct guitars, I get as close to the cabinet grill as possible to have as little room in those microphones as possible.
What are guitar impulse responses and how are they created?
So impulse responses are basically just you take a sine sweep and you sweep it through your guitar cabinet while it's mic'd up. And you take that recorded sine sweep and then you deconvolve it down into a response, which is just a little blip of audio that basically is that full frequency response put into something you can use as your guitar cabinet for plugins, or if you're doing your guitar amplifier direct and you need an IR for a direct sound, you can add that to an impulse loader. How they're made is pretty simple, but it does take a lot of trial and error to get them to feel right. So for me, when I was doing my impulse response pack that I did a few years ago, it took a while for me to figure out the exact milliseconds I needed for the sine sweep, which sine sweep to do, and then also finding the right mic placement to where it felt more and sounded more like my real cabinet mic.
How can you use IRs effectively with amp plugins to create great guitar tones?
So there's so many amp plugins out there that have their own built-in IRs, but when you buy impulse responses or you find impulse responses on the internet, like, it's good to go through them all and just figure out which ones sound good to you, because there's a lot of them that just don't sound great. But the best thing to do is find ones that you like and see if there's a way for you to blend certain ones together just to get a bigger sound. Because some on their own can sound a little bit thin, a little bit harsh. Some of them can be a little bit too bass heavy or a little bit too mid forward. So if you find like 5 or 10 that you really like, just put them in a folder by themselves just so you can just sift through those instead of doing like hundreds and hundreds of IRs. And then always try them together. See if you can get some cool blends out of them that'll make a unique sound or to make the amp sim sound the way you want it to.
Should you do audio processing for guitar IRs? And if so, how should you do it?
So when I made my impulse responses, I did 2 versions of them. I had my raw ones, which is basically no EQ, no compression, no nothing. It's just raw microphone directly through the cabinet back into my DAW. Then I made some other ones where I did EQ them. I'm not a big fan of compression on guitars, especially high gain, because they're already pretty compressed naturally. But for the IRs, I would just do a little bit of like, low pass, high pass on them, just kind of clean up a little bit of the low end, a little bit of the sizzle. And then if they did need anything in like the high mids, so like anywhere from like 1K to 6K, I'd go in and EQ that with the IR and then reprint the IR so you could use that process. But I would definitely say try both, because usually with the raw ones, you can do your own processing on them in your DAW to get the sound you want. Whereas like if it's already pre-processed, you're kind of stuck with that sound. You can do a little bit of tweaking to it, but sometimes you can introduce like weird artifacts and like weird phasing if it's already been processed.
Should you use a reverb on rhythm metal guitars in the mix?
You can. So I have done this a few times. If like, say like guitars are a little bit too outside of the mix, they're not really gluing into the mix how I want them to, I'll add like a subtle bit of reverb to help suck them back into the mix and help them glue better. It's not something you always need to use, but it definitely helps to have like a little bit of ambience on guitars sometimes just to get them to sit better. But most of the time, the guitar tones on the records that I've done don't have any reverb on them. But it's definitely not something that you should throw out the window and never try. Like if you have guitars and you're just like, man, these aren't sitting in the mix that well, just throw a little bit of like a plate reverb on them. Just turn it up a little bit in the mix on the guitars, and that should help put them in the mix a little bit better.
What EQ techniques do you recommend for mixing metal guitars?
So I go with the less is more approach to metal guitars, because I try to get the guitars to sound as good as possible from the source. If you don't have that ability, or you don't have the way to do that, and you're just using like amp sims, Of course, use whatever is going to help you get the sound you want. But for me, whenever I'm getting guitar tones, it literally on my guitar bus is just one plugin. I'm usually using just an EQ, and that's usually just doing high pass, low pass, maybe a little bit of cutting in like the whistle frequencies. But typically, like I try to keep that high end in there, and I try to keep as much of the natural low end. If I do have like some like really really like bass heavy guitars, like where they were using like either extended range instruments or like just super low tunings, I'll use the multiband like C4 just to kind of duck out those low mids a little bit on chugs. But it's only doing like maybe 1 or 2 dB of gain reduction just to kind of help tuck those in. But outside of that, like just getting the sound as close as possible naturally is the way that I've always done it. But if you get tones in that you don't like, don't be afraid to get an EQ and start figuring out what you can add or subtract from it to make it fit in your mix. And then if it is kind of all over the place dynamically, throw a compressor on it. Just start with a couple dB of compression just to see what happens. But if it doesn't feel right, just experiment until it sounds good.
Should metal guitars be compressed during mixing?
You can. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. Me personally, like when I look at guitar waveforms after you've reamped them, they're basically a squashed brick as it is. So there's no real dynamics going on unless you have like an amp that does have good dynamics to it. But the more gain you have on a sound, the more saturation, the more compressed that is going to be naturally. So I don't typically compress guitars that much. If I do, like I said, it's either just like a multiband, like C4, just kind of bringing down those low mids if it's kind of just bumping out a little bit too much. Or like if you use something like an LA3A in parallel, you can kind of just tame the low end a little bit, just shaving off a couple dB. But definitely don't be afraid to use compression on high gain guitars. I just don't think it's 100% needed unless like you feel like there's something missing on the guitars or they're just kind of unruly and you can't get them to sit the way you want to.
What are the differences between using a compressor, a clipper, and a limiter on a guitar bus in the mix?
So compression is just going to help tame your transients and your dynamics, kind of just help add a little bit of movement without just overly squashing the hell out of your sound. Whereas like a clipper, that's just going to clip the transients directly off and just make everything louder. Which for guitars, I don't like using clippers on guitars just because that does add artifacts. You're going to hear a lot of clicks and pops in the guitars when you do that. A limiter, on the other hand, like if you have some like super low tuned guitars, like that'll help just like keep everything streamlined to where they just kind of just stay put and you can help put them in the mix a little bit better. But you don't want to go too far with limiting either because it'll just make everything sound blown out. So usually if I'm doing either of those three for high gain guitars, I'm going to go with compression over limiting. I almost never use a clipper just because I don't like the crispy clicks and pops that you can get sometimes from using a clipper on high gain guitars.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pluskota, for such a wonderful interview and for such a knowledgeable interview. And thank you so much for your gift on creating sick guitar tones for different metal bands, because you are master of creating guitar tones. Maybe you should do some kind of fast track for Nail the Mix on creating guitar tones. It will be great. And thank you so much for everything you do for audio community in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell them to get me on board with doing a fast track for them. I'd be happy to do a guitar tone thing for them.